Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another lovely, wonderful podcast evening. It's a Wednesday night, but I'm sure you're listening to it on any other night of the week. And today we're going to be having another history hit and also another TV show hit. This is how we do things. We tie in TV shows with a bit of history, and we're going to be talking about Shogun. Oh yeah. How you doing, Josh?
I'm good, thanks. And having watched like some of the episodes, you can see like how great the TV series is that it's going to be. There's going to be like 10 episodes, and just looking like what all the critics have said, like, oh, amazing, best show on television. It's like, and having watched it, it's like the fantasy of like playing, as we mentioned before, like Total War Shogun. And then actually watching the TV series, you get those kind of vibes, especially with the things that happen throughout the TV series.
Oh, definitely. And full disclaimer, I'm a massive fan of Shogun Total War, so it's going to be difficult not to like just constantly talk about that game, but let's see how it goes. So, Shogun, what's the general premise of it? So Shogun follows the collision of two ambitious men from different worlds and a mysterious woman samurai. One of the ambitious men is John Blackthorne, a risk-taking English sailor who ends up shipwrecked in Japan, a land whose unfamiliar culture will ultimately redefine him. Then the other ambitious man is Lord Toranaga, a shrewd, powerful daimyo at odds with his own dangerous political rivals, and Lady Mariko, a woman with invaluable skills but dishonorable family ties who must prove her value and allegiance. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And just a disclaimer, we both only watched the first two episodes. We're going to do this in maybe 2 or 3 episode parts. So there's still more coming out. And this is a Wednesday. So I think episode 6 is out today, maybe, or episode 5.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how many episodes are going to be in a full series, but
I think, there's going to be 10 episodes in total.
Yeah. So the key thing about Shogun is it's based on a book released in 1975 by James Clavell. Not much more I could say about that. Never heard of the book. There's also a original movie or TV show about it.
No.
Was that Shogun original? Let's see. When was it? La 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 la. Original movie. Totally forgot about this. I would have done it in the research. And I don't know. So 1980 is a miniseries.
Okay.
So only 5 years after the book. I mean, the book must have been really popular to get a miniseries like that.
Yeah, and was it like America? Was it any of the major channels, and also was it like all in English as well, especially like what the Americans do?
I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I'd be interested to find out, because one thing I do really like about Shogun is it really brings great honor to the languages apart from Portuguese.
Yeah, and Latin as well.
Yeah, and Latin and Spanish, because it's set in the 1600s, so the English that John Blackthorne speaks in it is somewhat like of the time, but it feels a bit modern. Like his insults sound very of the time, but I think they've obviously chosen modern English. Japanese, the Japanese characters speak Japanese in it, so that's fantastic. I hate shows where they completely wash it, or at least, I like it when they do something like Vikings, for example. So in Vikings, you see all the Vikings speaking in English to each other until they come across the Saxons, and then they speak the language they're supposed to speak. So it reminds you, FYI, they're not speaking English the whole time.
And just buttressing the point on like Vikings is that the fact that they would also have their accents. So then when you had the situation, I think it was season 3, when you had like a Swedish Viking, he had a distinct Swedish accent. And like when in season 4, I believe, when they go to
Francia,
that they actually, when they're not speaking to the Franks, they hear them in French. But when they're actually, we hear the Franks talking to each other, then speak in English. And then it's just the fact that they continue that continuity, that if you start a scene with a specific group, and then someone else comes in, you then have that language. Like, for example, when you'd have like the Northumbria, and also you would have like Wessex, the kings of each just talking to each other or having discussions. It would be very, very English accents. But then when like a Dane or a Norse person would come into the scene, it would be like, you know what? No, they're speaking
Saxon.
They're speaking. Yeah, I think Saxon but then also that they would be speaking Danish, and also sometimes in scenes when both would be speaking English, they'd be like, yeah, but what did he just say? Be like, you're both spoken English.
Yeah, it's true. I quite like that though. It's a good way to remind people, but I guess still appeal to like an international audience.
Yeah.
With Shogun, the Japanese characters speak Japanese, but the only thing that's a bit mean is the Portuguese and Spanish characters speak English.
Yeah.
Like you hear the accents on them, but you don't hear them speak Portuguese, I don't think, even when they're translating for the Japanese.
But it could be, I think the reason they've done this is to, I think, kind of like have the focus on the Japanese culture. So like if you're watching it, you kind of have a grasp of like what potential Spanish and Portuguese culture is.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a basis, you've probably heard, especially from like a Western media type side, you've heard of Spanish, the language, you've heard people speak it, you understand how Portuguese and how that plays into it. You've probably learned a bit of Portuguese and Spanish history. But I think it's like having like Japanese, the only language that's non-English spoken, then shows the actual huge divide, which I think the whole like first two episodes focuses on, is like how different Japanese culture is to like European Western culture. And even though there's divisions between like the English, the Spanish and the Portuguese, it's a whole nother level when you then bring in Japanese culture and also the Japanese language.
Yeah, I guess so. And it kind of amplifies the point that, this is the 1600s. The Japanese, at the time of the show, the Japanese already encountered foreigners, but it's only been Portuguese and Spanish. They haven't met any, they definitely haven't met any English people. I don't know if they'd met any Dutch people by that point, but it's it shows the times that the Europeans can speak to each other and understand each other because of necessity, out of diplomacy and war, and just because they're neighbors. But just the Japanese element, the Japanese people are like, they didn't even know like England exists. They must have known. They definitely knew Portugal existed, but you just don't know. Maybe they knew Spain existed. It's really hard to say, but it's reflected all the time because Spain and Portugal and maybe the Dutch. I think the Dutch golden era was possibly at this time, or maybe before. It seemed like Portugal and Spain, this was their golden era, and the English were sort of playing catch up. Yeah. Especially with the role of John Blackthorne.
Yeah, and even himself. Just basing on what you said, it was also catch up for the French as well. And the main reason for this was the Americas. So the Pope signed a papal bull to say that, basically papal law saying that only the Spanish and the Portuguese could travel to the New World. So in the 1400s, the British couldn't, the French couldn't, the Holy Roman Empire couldn't, the Dutch couldn't, because everyone at the time was Catholic. Yeah. But then when the Reformation took place, they were like, well, we're no longer Catholic anyway, so we can just go there ourselves. So then that's when you started to have, in the late 1500s and also 1600s, privateers like Sir Francis Drake or others who would then go off, travel the world, being sponsored by, for example, the Dutch that you see in Shogun, and or by the British Empire, or by maybe some of the German princes as well, to then go out to the New World, explore, gather trade, gather information, and then develop trade routes. But because I think it was maybe like 100 or 150 years advantage that Spain and Portugal had, they utilized it to then go to the Americas, North, South, and Central America, travel to Africa, use them. So basically, one thing that people forget about history is that the reason why Christopher Columbus, I know this is a tangent, folks.
No, go on. It all feeds into it.
Wanted to go west, not to find out that if the world was round or not, because at the time they did believe the world was round. It was to try and circumvent the Suez Canal,
and the Ottomans,
because the Ottomans had control over it and didn't want to go all the way around Africa to then get to India. So he thought, well, if the world is round as we know it, let's go west and then reach India on the other side. But in fact, they actually met upon the continent of the continent of North and South America, and hence why we get the name the West Indies.
Yeah, exactly. Well done, Christopher Columbus.
So what happened? They then did was then they started then using that trade route, which they mentioned in the series, to then go out to Asia. So then that's when, like, which is mentioned in the TV series, Jesuit priests, the Spanish and the Portuguese would go out to, like, for example, the Philippines has a very strong Spanish
Catholic
feeling into it as well. And also, to your point, the Dutch as well. The Dutch had former colonies as well, so they also probably later on they actually went out there as well. But the advantage the Spanish had was basically on the papal bull, and with the Reformation, which is kind of linking into the TV show with Protestantism, especially growing in Northern Europe and also Northwestern Europe. They were then like, well, we no longer have to listen to this papal bull. We can now explore anywhere we want to.
Screw this bullshit. Woo! And I think you've hit the nail on the head there pretty well, because you've got the religion that plays into it, which is very clear in the show. Seeing the Christian lords that have been converted by the Portuguese, as well as sort of the Portuguese expansionist plan, so using Macau as like a sort of staging ground, and that had some involvement in some rebellion that happened in Japan before the show. The only thing you haven't mentioned is what was the treaty that the Spanish and Portuguese drew up to divide the world in half? They mention it in the show.
Yeah, they did mention it.
I can't remember what it's called,
I forgot what it's called, but yeah. So basically, I think that's why majority of South America, Latin America, so Central and South America, were Spanish colonies. Mm-hmm. So even with, like, you've got Mexico, which was called New Spain. You've also got, like, Argentina, and the only real Portuguese settlement there was with Brazil. So it kind of seems like that Portugal said, we'll take Brazil, you can take
the rest
Central
of South America. Well, from what they understood of the shape of it, And
because I think also people forget that, like, some of the West Indian islands, like Jamaica was named by the Spanish, was a Spanish colony. Trinidad and Tobago is also used to be a Spanish colony, because Trinidad in Spanish is Trinity, signifying the three islands that Trinidad has. Then also you've got Cuba. So it seems like they basically said, you take Spain, you take Central and South America, and we'll take the Far East. So you did have Jesuit priests going out to Japan, to China, to Korea as well. And I believe also they had a bit of a stronghold in the Philippines.
Yeah. I mean, it's so crazy to imagine that, really. So, for example, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is where the sort of governments of Spain and Portugal decided to divide the world, was in 1494. And so, like, even that early, can you imagine what it'd been like just traveling at that time? Like, this, you see that in the start of the TV show, the English, John Blackthorne and arriving in Japan, they're starving, they're stinky, and the Japanese have no way of communicating with them because they don't speak English. They think the Portuguese is the only way, really.
Yeah, and I think the key point that I believe the TV show shows is that the Portuguese and Spanish became more advanced than the British and also the French because of that, I think maybe 150-year advantage they had. And then also you see with John as well, he realizes, wait a second, my viewpoints of calling these people savages is completely wrong, especially when he gets to Osaka and he's like, damn, this is nothing like any of the cities back home. Yeah,
and have you read, like, historically who he's based off and what eventually happens to him? Have you spoiled the TV show?
No, I haven't.
Do you want me to spoil it for you? I can say who he's based off, but I won't spoil the TV show. So John Blackthorne is based on a real-life English navigator called William Adams, who was indeed the first Englishman to visit Japan in 1600 on the dot. Cool timing, I must say. It's interesting because, when do you think Japan was actually discovered?
I believe it was...
by the Europeans.
By the Europeans, I believe it was early maybe late 1400s.
So it says not until the 16th century that Japan was discovered by Europe, when a Chinese ship with Portuguese passengers was blown off course and wrecked on a Tanagashima Island. The first Christian mission was founded in Japan by Jesuit priest Francis Xavier in 1549. But yeah, it doesn't actually give a very specific date. I guess it's very hard to actually determine it just because of this period of time. But crazy though, really, just that sort of time period.
Yeah.
And let's not delve into this too much, but one cool nugget of history I want to touch on as well as the first circumnavigation in the world, which was accomplished on the 8th of September 1522, when a Spanish vessel, Victoria, under the command of Spanish navigator Juan Sebastian, reached Seville, Spain. That ship had originally set out from Andalusia, Spain, on the 20th of September 1519 and returned on the 8th of September 1522. So 3 years later, and almost to the bloody day, that would have been bloody fantastic. Well done, Juan Sebastian de Elcano.
And you just have to think about it, like with modern travel, you can go from here to Australia
in a day.
Yeah. So 2 days, but
2 years. Yeah. That shows you, if people are worried about how much religion held us back technology wise, which I wouldn't say is necessarily true. It's a bit of a overall summary, but we've come pretty far since taking almost 2 years to circumnavigate the globe. That's crazy.
Yeah. And also I think another key thing that especially just the whole depiction of the show is that it kind of feels like the colliding of two cultures.
Right, and which cultures? What, European and Eastern?
I think more like English and the Japanese, because you kind of feel like in the first two episodes you see the camaraderie and also that there are ties between Portugal and Spain and Japan. Mm-hmm. But for John, everything is full on first time seeing something, and also the surprise with the Japanese of there are other forms of Christianity. There is a place called England. Mm. There's also potentially the Dutch as well. So it's not just out there if we head west, it's not just the Portuguese and Spanish. There are other nations.
Yeah, and the leader, let's get the names up. It's so bad for starting a TV show. It takes me until episode 4 to work out who they're talking about, Lord Toranaga. I was kind of wondering, why is he so interested in this, quite frankly, incredibly rude Englishman? Because, not gonna lie, if I landed a new culture, was in a desperate situation, I would not go around screaming in people's faces who, I guess they couldn't understand what he was saying, but he really wasn't helping himself and saying enemy Anjin and stuff. But yeah, you slowly start to see, I think it's in episode 2, it comes out more, why Toranaga wants him, and it's basically his knowledge. Also, Toranaga is very curious. He's a minister of foreign affairs or something, so I guess it's kind of his job in that weird regency situation they've got in Japan there. And yeah, as you say, finding out new information because the Spanish and Portuguese were very conveniently keeping that quiet. I wonder why. But to sort of continue on sort of the time period, just to get an understanding of this. So John Blackthorne, first English navigator to reach Japan in 1600. He did so on a trading ship called the Liefde, which maybe is a Dutch ship, under the leadership of Jacob Quackenjag. I am killing these accents. Thank you very much. It was the only vessel to reach Japan from a 5-ship exhibition launched by a company of Rotterdam, i.e. Dutch merchants. So again, that's quite on point in the TV show. They do mention that, especially at the beginning. I don't know why. I assume the guy who shoots himself in it is Jacob Quackenjag. But still, I mean, that was a very intense start to the show, but very cool. Yeah. And one thing I loved was actually seeing the ship arrive in Japan. It looks spooky and haunted with its torn sails. Very cool. Yeah,
and the fact that, just imagine you're one of the villagers, because it's highly unlikely that they'd seen any other type of European ship, because most likely the Portuguese landed on another part of the island, or the Spanish on another part of the island. So then you've got a situation where you see a ship that has nothing to do with what you've seen. And
it looks alien.
It does. And the fact that the person who comes, some of the people have probably never seen a European in their whole life. So when they actually come off the ship, I remember when they keep them prisoner, he's talking to them in Japanese and asking them to do stuff in Japanese, but it kind of didn't really click to him that, oh no, they could be something. Maybe he might have thought
they were
that
Portuguese,
and potentially they've learnt the language because they've been here long enough to learn it. But it's to him, he didn't realize, actually, no, they're actually English. And I think one of the things that the show also kind of like takes away is that the pride that Blackthorn always has is like, oh, well, these savages finding out that bathing more than two times in a week, it might bring the influx and the fact that
the pox.
he thinks that he could catch a pox from it, or when he's actually being treated, when he's like, oh, is this person going to bleed me out, so then all the bad humors can then leave my blood.
Like leeching and stuff.
Because then there was a point in time, I think even during, it was during the like 1400s, maybe up until the 1600s, until like the Reformation really kicked in England, that people believed that, oh, if someone's got a poisoning of the blood, you must let it out and then put it back into the body. And then I think it sounds dumb now, but they actually thought that, just because I think maybe they didn't know that blood carries oxygen. So like, if there's blood in it, pour out the impure blood, clean the blood, and then put it back into the body. So that's what he was getting to. But then you then see like how advanced medicine in Japan was.
And cleanliness and hygiene,
compared to England. And then the fact that throughout a long period of time, I think just because of like, sometimes they call it like the Western ownership of history, that you start to then think that, oh, for a very long period of time, Western nations have been the most powerful, the most
advanced, leading the way in everything. It's just not true. So, we talk about the Spanish and Portuguese golden years, but the Ottoman Empire, I guess maybe Turkish isn't the right thing to say, but for a very long period of time was possibly the leading power in Europe. The amount of land they controlled, and the whole point of the Christians exploring and sailing out as far west as they could go was to basically escape that blockade, as you say.
100%.
And the amount that they discovered as well. There's even like some theories that because the Ottoman Empire and a lot of these affiliated Arabic states cultivated drinking coffee, that's what helped them spark a golden era. Because think about how much more you can do, how much more productive.
And like one of the things that the Ottomans had that they took from I've forgotten what the group was. Might have been the people in charge of Baghdad. Because of the Silk Road, they were at the interjection where Europe met Asia. Right. So then they would then be able to then take all the knowledge that went into Europe. They would then accept it. So like there was a huge library within Baghdad that came up. That's the period of like, they call it the golden period of Islam. So you had algebra coming through. You had like many different mathematics. You had, I think, the discovery, the alphabet, yes. And then also stuff like, I think penicillin and other things were then taken from China. So a lot of stuff was being housed and written and grouped there. So you had knowledge coming from Europe that was meeting there. You also had knowledge from Africa, knowledge from Asia.
So all meeting all the best bits of everything.
And I think that's what the Ottoman Empire then built up on, because all trade until like the Sea Age really kicked off. And I think that's when Europe became superpowers, is that they took advantage of seafaring and the Sea Age to circumvent the Ottoman Empire. But before that, if you want to trade to China, you're then going to have to go through the vast Ottoman Empire.
That is a very good point, They had like a monopoly on it, essentially. And then so the Europeans used technology. They were innovative with the use of ships. But again, we can't, like, it's interesting because of the effects of European powers taking the lead through the imperial period from the 1600s onwards to the modern era. It's very easy to think that Europe was just leading the way the whole time, but we just really weren't. And then also Europe was so divided. We're just constantly at war with each other, like the 100-Year War, etc. But still fascinating stuff. Like I could talk about this all damn day. It's crazy. It's kind of an exciting time as well, exploring the world like that. So where were I? Okay, so among the few survivors of the expedition who reached Japan for more than a decade, the authorities did not allow Adam and his second mate to leave the country. Earlier, they did permit Quakarnayak and Melchior van Sandervoort to return to the Dutch Republic to establish formal trade relations. So I guess one thing that's not shown so much in the show is the Dutch actually, after a little while, have taken advantage and actually established trade relations with Japan. So this is much a big deal for Japan as it is for England. I'm not going to say much more about the English navigator William Adams, who John Blackthorne is based on, because there'll be spoilers, and we're doing episode by episode. So I guess one thing that is difficult not to talk about in Shogun is aspects of Japanese culture. So, you clearly see things that I guess I know because I've been playing the games, but I'm going to ask these questions anyway so we can sort of suss them out. So, what's a samurai?
I think the oversimplification for samurai is the Japanese form of a knight.
Yeah.
But I think it's just really oversimplified because it's more than that. Because the issue with knights, many of them are basically on retainer to a count or a duke or a king,
lord,
a lord. And what they basically had to do was that they were then sponsored to be a knight in service to that lord, which is very similar to Japan. But it's also they were also into they were also literate as well. And I think also the fact that they actually had a full-on way of life and also a form of martial art added to it as well. So it kind of feels like it's not just like a knight. It's more to do with like a way of life of... So I would kind of say with like fantasy worlds, kind of like a paladin type thing. It's not just they're a fighter who has a sword, but it's also there are etiquette that a samurai must do. Like you kind of see it in like episode 1 where they all are kneeling and when the council then all come or the council of regents all come and meet and they all are then just sitting there and then that one samurai speaks out of turn.
Yeah.
And is so ready to then
commit seppuku. Yeah.
And basically say that he will cancel out his whole line.
Yeah, and like they pick up on that quite well. It shows the importance of honor, saving face, but also following like conventions and ways of doing things. And just the fact that the sort of seppuku thing is one way that definitely differentiates samurai from European knights. Because I don't think because I guess in Christianity back then, suicide was still considered a wrong. It was never expected that you'd save, as a knight, you'd save your honor by committing suicide. So there's definitely a lot of differences with it.
And even just based off like feudalism, which knights come from, is that so basically feudalism was set up that in a king or a duke or a count must be able to have the ability to uphold their knights and also to look after the land that they have. So that's why sometimes where you would have like a duke or a count fighting each other, and then that was a part of the feudal system because it's basically saying that, well, if you are a knight or, if you are a duke or a count, you should be able to look after the people that you are in charge of. But then it seems like, for example, if a knight wasn't being well paid, they could then eventually... Once their term of service had ended, they could then leave. But it seems like with samurai, it's like honor has banded them with their, I think it's called daimyo in Japan, and that they're there with them for life and that they're willing to sacrifice themselves, their families, their whole livelihoods for their daimyo because they have sworn an oath to do so.
Yeah, and it goes so far with that, like fighting to the death and stuff. Yeah. Like, for example, here we go, in Shogun... Total War, a very great video game by Creative Assembly. Also, watch our episode on it, or the Total War series. They literally fight to the death. Like, it's pretty crazy. But again, I don't know how exaggerated that is. People are human beings, and well, does everyone necessarily fight to the death in a castle siege? You don't know.
But to your point, I think someone was saying that no matter what the culture is, there's something that's embedded to try and not like breed control, but breed like a form of stability.
Yeah,
And,
there's
like,
some
each-
kind of order. So
And each-
knights, samurai.
And like each culture has like something that's written in code. So like whether if it's like tied to religion, which in Western Europe, which was divine right, in China they called it like the mandate of heaven, which the emperor would have, and then you kind of see it's kind of mentioned in episode 2 when they're talking about Toranaga's family and the fact that I think that she said she had some form of like level of devotion to Japan, and that they had some form of like reason to rule. And like each society sets a list of rules to say that to keep things intact and keep things, as you said, to keep a form of order and stability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think that's what's evolved within Japanese culture to then enable that form of leadership and also dedication to the status quo.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's a thing that comes out of, I don't know about Japan, but just the medieval period in Europe, because quite frankly, human beings are evil creatures who are greedy and will kill someone to get their land, etc., their wealth. So the whole idea is you have this power over them, this law that is quite brutal at times, like public executions and stuff, but to keep people in line.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is having the religion to moralize people to stop them from killing their neighbors, but then also having like some sort of caste or class in society to be aspiring, to basically be examples for people to follow, not necessarily for them to become like to become a samurai, become a knight, but basically to follow their example and have 100%. These high ideals. Yeah, I totally get that.
And like, I think what someone said is like, now we've turned them into celebrities. Like for so long, it was either the strongest, the wisest, the one who was the most beautiful, the one who had the most power. But it's more moved towards like celebrities. Like it's
Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, like it's mentioned by Married through the whole episode that her husband is like this really high up.
Mariko?
Yeah. Mariko, that her husband's like a warrior, and like even within many different societies for so many years, they would revere warriors so much, and they would see them as being the ideal people to then follow.
Yeah, I guess so. Also, her husband seems like an asshole as well.
He is.
That's definitely going to come out soon. Yeah. Okay, let's continue with this Japanese culture quiz. What's a ronin?
I used to know what this is, but I think
It is mentioned in... Well, it's not mentioned what they are, but they are mentioned in episode 2, I think, of Shogun.
Yeah, they are. I believe it's either a samurai without a daimyo or basically a samurai without honor.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. It's in feudal Japan, a wandering samurai who has no lord or master. Mm-hmm. I mean, perhaps it could also mean that as well, that they've been stripped of like their rank out of dishonor and haven't done seppuku or something. I'm not sure. Okay, next question. What's a shogun? I'm sure we'll find out more further in the show, but we should find out now.
A shogun... I think it's something they would call, like, in Rome, like, during, like, the Republic. Sometimes they would call them, like, which is now vilified now, but like a dictator.
Yeah.
So someone who's, like, a political but also military leader who's put over the kingdom or the country to rule it. And then they're not really a king, but it's more of like they have the political, military, and financial power to then rule the nation.
Yeah, like a de facto right to rule through power, through force, really. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The briefest way to describe a shogun is a military dictator who ruled over Japan. And some history about it, without spoiling anything, is the office of shogun was in practice hereditary, although over the course of the history of Japan, several different clans held the position. Yep. And that's what you see in Shogun Total War, the video game. You see the period of Japan that's referred to as a Sengoku Jidai, which is basically somewhat a civil war in which warring states, i.e. warring clans, a period from the 15th century to the beginning of the 17th century, where they're just fighting, vying for control, and eventually to become the Shogun. A key thing to say there is, that's actually before what happens in this TV show, Shogun. So, and it seems like for some reason the position of Shogun doesn't exist at the start of the TV show. You have a regent. I guess maybe he was Shogun, but then he's dying. Is his name Taiko? Was he? Yeah, because one thing that's not mentioned is where's the emperor in all of this? Is there an emperor?
Unless he was the emperor and that the now child that he's looking after, is he then the emperor? Or have they got to a period where they've forsaken the emperor because maybe the line has died out and now they just have a shogun who's then passed it on to the council because he realizes that if he doesn't, they'll probably just kill his son and the next big person will then take the title of shogun.
Yeah, I guess
but that is something to explain because you don't really hear anyone say emperor.
Yeah,
or any
exactly.
form of it through the first 2 episodes.
Yeah, and that's kind of a question I had really, is like, where is there an emperor at this stage? Because I know from the video game Shogun 2, well, there's an emperor, but also what is his relationship to the Shogun? Because it seems like to me that the emperor is very much a ceremonial figurehead appointed by God, as it would be in Europe as divine right. But they don't actually make decisions, or they rarely do. They leave affairs of state to a shogun.
Yeah, it kind of, funny enough, reminds me of the situation in Dune. That you do have the what are they called again? The council in Dune. Landsraad.
Landsraad, yeah.
Landsraad. You have the Landsraads, which is kind of similar to the actual council, the regents of the Council of Regents. And that the emperor is more of like a figurehead, which is very different from like Western culture, where we would have an emperor who basically would be in charge, or a king who would be in charge, and then they would have a council who would then do and play out his orders. But at times, if the emperor or king or queen wasn't powerful enough, you would then have like a faction who would kind of like strong arm the king.
Move,
but then not to be like full on the actual emperor is a figurehead, and then you also have either a shogun who's running the show or actually having a council who are actually running the show.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Maybe it'll become a bit more clear as episodes go on. Some interesting things we can point out about the show. So let's maybe summarize episode 1, episode 2. Episode 1 we've kind of already summarized. You're very much introduced to the plot. You have a stinking Englishman arriving in a Japan that's already encountered Christianity and Portuguese, and even has Western firearms, like you see muskets in it. You have the Lord Taranaga, who is essentially being held hostage by this council, who are incredibly rude and trying to provoke him in any way they can. It's typical gaslighting. I've seen this drama play out before. That pretty much sums up episode 1. And you got Mariko. You get introduced to Mariko as well, who's very useful in translating and sort of calming people down, showing other ways of, not other ways of power, but other ways people can be useful rather than just wielding a sword and slicing someone up.
Yeah, and I think like one of the offset that they do show is that the violence of the period.
Oh,
especially
God,
like when the guy sees John being about to be dragged out and then be questioned. He does a sign of the cross, and the guy just brings out his katana and chops his head off, and is like,
"Yeah, that's like, literally nuts." Yeah,
and I think the point is like, I think they just want to show like this is a time period where tensions are high.
Yeah.
And because tensions are high, there are likelihood to be a lot of violence taking place during the whole period. And I think the one thing I really do love in the show is John's character.
Oh yeah, he's great. The way he speaks.
And also like when I was watching it with Jeffrey, and I was like, his voice sounds it's too old. It's too old for his body. Like he looks way too young to be sounding like that.
Yeah, he's got a very like, I wouldn't say grumbly voice, but very like John Blackthorne. Like it sounds very put on, but I quite like how the actor, he seems to be doing a good job at maybe a bit too cartoon of the voice, but I think he fits it well. And can I just say, like, Oh, I can't, like, if I was him, just the way he's gone about trying to convince people not to kill him. If I was one of the Japanese people, I would have killed him just out.
Yeah.
You know, this is a barbarian, and like, whilst they seem to be like somewhat tolerated, they're not like treated with suspicion and not accepted because they just don't know how to communicate. They stink. They don't follow the customs. So just how John Blackthorne behaves is quite funny in a way. I find that kind of amusing.
I also feel like, you know, when he's there with the Catholic, the Jesuit monk, and they stand before, I forgot what his name is. It's Yashi, you know, the lord who owns the fiefdom where the ship arrives.
Yeah.
When he's being interviewed, and then they bring in the Catholic Portuguese priest.
Yeah.
Like the one-upmanship between both of them in their argument.
Yeah. And then John Blackthorne eventually gets dragged away and he's like, stick your thing up your arse or something. Stick your religion up your arse. So I was like, oh, great. But in like a very old English way, which makes it even funnier. Yeah, that was quite cool. What else can I think of from episode 1 that was...
Did he meet the Spanish sailor in episode? I think it was
it was definitely in
episode
1.
Well, like when the fact that the Spanish sailor Rodriguez is basically calling them like pricks and bastards, and because they don't understand Portuguese, he's like, yes. So now you need to bow to this bastard here. And I was like, damn.
He's like a king here, yes. Yeah, that's so funny, and it just always makes you wonder. Like, I mean, I only speak English, but I'm trying to learn Polish at the moment. It's just like, if you can speak another language in front of someone they don't know, and you could get away with saying anything. As long as you don't name them and make them suspicious, boom, easy peasy.
But one thing that you do see with John is that he has a good grasp on language and he picks it up quickly. And he's somehow learning Japanese quite well, isn't he? Like, bro. He sometimes like picks up like cultural aspects. You kind of see it a bit at the beginning of like episode 1, but as we go into episode 2 more, you kind of see that
bowing, for example.
He's starting to learn bit by bit. But I think at times he could have done, as you said, a whole lot better, but just saw himself as, I'm this Englishman here with these savages. How dare you treat me like this?
Typical swashbuckling Englishman, sword at hip, just like, oh, yes. And like, you know, when a Japanese come down into the ship at the beginning, the first thing the English do is to fight them. I guess... There's some sort of psychology about when you see someone armored coming towards you are very nervous and on edge. But come on, man, like have some common sense. But I guess back then it's like a very different judgy time. Everyone's looking down on each other. Everyone looks at foreigners with suspicion. Okay, here's a question for you. What does the word gaijin mean?
Gaijin. Not sure. What does it mean?
Barbarian. It's the Japanese word for it. For some reason, I can't remember they said it in a show, but that's what the Japanese would call barbarians / foreigners, gaijin. So maybe that's something we'll see come up. We'll save that for later.
But also one thing that they do mention that they might show like flashbacks for is the war between Korea and Japan.
They do mention that,
mention it quite a lot. They mention it's not that much in episode 1, but as we go through like episode 2, as we discuss it later, they do talk about it.
Yeah.
And possibly maybe in the later on in the series, you might then see like how does like Korea and also China as well, how do they then interact into this story or this time period? Because also you did have the Jesuits in Korea and also in China.
Yeah,
and also
Macau.
You had the issues between like China and Japan, that they constantly at this period of time distrustful of each other. And I think maybe the Qing dynasty, I believe it was in China at the time. I might be getting this wrong, but I think they actually also supported Korea to stop the Japanese invasion.
Yeah, I've seen I remember watching a Korean movie a while ago about the attempted Japanese invasion of Korea, at least back then, but it's happened many times in history, and unfortunately it was successful. One thing that I found out, because I love watching historical dramas, like as soon as I finished the episode, I just go on Wikipedia and read it for hours, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool, this nugget of history. You know the phrase kamikaze in Japanese? It translates to divine wind, and that originates from the Mongolians tried to invade Japan in way before that, when the show was set. I think like 1200s, maybe 1300s. Yeah, and the only thing that's pretty much saved the Japanese was just terrible winds that destroyed a Mongolian fleet.
And like there's a PlayStation game called Ghost of Tsushima.
Oh, right,
that's the island they actually invaded.
Oh, wow, okay.
I think they were the only like major Asian country today that wasn't invaded. So
Japan?
The Mongols invaded parts of Vietnam. They invaded parts of Korea, but couldn't control all of it. They basically disbanded the different dynasties in China. But then, the Japanese, because of the situation of their islands as well, and also the poor weather, they couldn't actually utilize that to then invade.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. Have you played that game, Ghosts of
No.
Tsushima?
My brother's played it. He really loves it. And just a quick nugget there. I believe for those who have watched like Marco Polo.
I've watched a bit of it. Yeah,
the Khan in Marco Polo. I keep on forgetting.
Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan is the one who initiates the invasion of Japan.
Oh, really? Okay, I need to rewatch Marco Polo. I watched it on and off with my brother, and I found it quite good. The Rotten Tomatoes reviews didn't do it very well, but the episodes I watched, I thought it seemed bloody awesome.
I really enjoyed it, but unfortunately, like it ended. It was a Netflix show that was really expensive, so they ended it after season 2. So they left it on a cliffhanger.
Well, maybe they'll come back to it one day. We'll see. Another thing to touch on in episode 1 as well, more extreme violence. The bloody torture execution they did with one of the, English prisoners. The ship, they just put him... At first I thought he's screaming because they're going to give him a bath or something.
As soon as I saw it, I knew what they were going to do, because there's an actual scene for scene similar to that takes place in Marco Polo.
Oh, right, okay.
And the Mongols do that to their Chinese prisoners.
Oh, bloody hell. Yeah. What is it, with like acid or just boiling water?
Boiling. So what they did was you saw that, you didn't get to see it, but basically you saw the scene of all of them in a cage in Marco Polo, and they would, I think, like cut their hands off and then put them into a boiling. Yeah.
Gee, what a savage. Honestly, people say we live in like terrible times, but man, just imagine being alive in like, I don't know, even before the 1900s, like, especially in these eras, like the medieval era stuff, and before that, just wow, getting your hands chopped off and then dropped into a boiling pot of water.
Yeah.
When I saw that happen, I was laughing at first because they don't show you immediately.
Yeah, they don't know.
I was laughing at first. It's like, wow, God, I know they're like English people didn't wash, but like I didn't realize they resented it that much that they're like thought going into a bathtub would do that. Because I thought they were just giving him a wash. I was like, but then screaming, and like a girlfriend knew straight away, and I was like, oh man. And then I can't remember the name of the character, but that little lord, the one who's like
fiefdom, the one
who's I would say loyal to Taranaga, but he's so like wibbly wobbly with his loyalty, isn't he? I can't remember his name. I'll try and look him up. He has some obsession with, the moment before someone dies?
Yeah.
Like he likes to savor it for some reason. I can't tell if he's going to be a badass character, like when he rescued the Spanish dude from that cliffside, because he looked pretty badass and cool there. But then,
or is he going to be a complete nutcase?
Yeah, well, he seems to like play all sides really, isn't it, as well?
And I think another key point to mention was that John Blackthorne also mentions is that when he was trying to save this sort of Spanish sailor, I think he's also the Spanish pilot, Rodriguez. Once he slipped and fell and thought he was going to drown, he was about to slit his throat.
Sorry, say that again.
So when that guy who was in charge of the fiefdom, when he had fallen and was in the water and thought that he might drown, he was about to then slit his throat.
Kill himself, yeah. Yeah, that was interesting to choose the way he died or something. I was like, okay, this is an interesting looking
people have
culture.
said that drowning is like one of the worst ways. I think they said starvation and drowning are two of some of the like worst forms to
I guess because they take so long.
Yeah, and that's why it's funny, because earlier, I think maybe it was episode 2, it was episode 1, the Spanish sailor Rodriguez, when John Blackthorne asked him, can you swim? And he says, no, it's better off to drown quickly. He does have a point, like, if you're in the middle of the ocean, swimming doesn't matter. Like,
yeah, because eventually, if you're somehow floating, you'll just end up starving, won't you? Bloody hell, that's pretty savage, isn't it? I mean, I still feel like getting boiled to death in a big pot. I mean, your hands cut off as well.
But they also mentioned something they also did to some Christians as well, which they mention in episode 2 is also crucifixions.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic, really, like the Christians. And I guess one thing I found interesting is how accepted, apart from, I guess, you see a Christian getting his head chopped off in it, you do get Christian lords already at that point in time. It's amazing how well the missionaries had been converting people in Japan, that the lords, the landed gentry, I guess you could call them, actually were some of them were Christians themselves, and I guess that leads well into episode 2. I mean, I love the way episode 1 ended as well, just with John Blackthorne bowing before Toranaga.
Yes,
that was very cool. So on to episode 2. The question I've got for you is, what is a black ship?
Yes, I do know this from Shogun Total War.
Yeah, I bet you do.
It's the mark of the Portuguese ships. So a lot of them were like trading vessels, but a lot of them would trade, whether if it was with China, also with of Japan. They would trade with them cannons or potentially gunpowder as well, bringing in stuff from Europe, and then also then take stuff from Japan. And then, as you mentioned in episode 2, that they also used as an intermediary between China and Japan, that they would buy stuff from China, sell it in Japan, buy stuff in Japan, sell it in China, because they both were basically blockading each other at the time.
Yeah.
So they were utilizing that relationship, and also because they had such powerful ships compared to China and Japan at the time, they could also go a lot further, a lot faster as well.
Yeah, and you remember in the game as well, if you somehow managed to capture the black ship in Shogun 2 Total War, it's so like you literally could send one black ship against an entire Japanese fleet and just absolutely destroy them with the cannons. Like, badass and very intimidating looking. That must have scared the hell out of the Japanese when they first encountered it.
And that's probably why, like, Toranaga was basically thinking the importance of this Englishman is that, one, we don't have to just rely on the Spanish/Portuguese for who can then trickle us resources and information. We have another avenue to therefore get information, maybe goods. And if I can then get this Englishman onto my side, I can then utilize him to then take out my adversaries. Yeah,
exactly. And I won't spoil history because I went on a really good Wikipedia deep dive about who John Blackthorne's based on. But essentially, and you see that in episode 2, Toranaga has a use for him because the knowledge he has, and that perhaps might give him a leading edge. But you also saw that with, I found out his name, the little lord underneath Toranaga, he's called Toda, that's it, Kashigi Yabushige. That's the weird flaky one. His plan was originally like, we'll get the Englishman, he has knowledge of ships, perhaps he can help us, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But then that's actually what Toranaga's doing.
Yeah.
But so
also,
come in handy.
I think his flakiness is based on the culture and also the fact that Toranaga is a prisoner. And the main issue also is with the state of honor at the time. If Toranaga is then defeated, he will then commit suicide, but also his samurai, his generals, his household.
Even John Blackthorne?
Yes.
God, that's nuts.
So he was basically hedging his bets that, okay, then because also it was 4 against 1. So it was like, if he ends up losing and also he's under house arrest in Osaka, I need to find a way out so I don't end up my head on the chopping block.
A trump card. Yeah. I also found that funny how just the zigzagging back and forth of John Blackthorne. Yeah, he's in a country where he doesn't speak the language, no idea where he is or what's going on, just only what Portuguese or Spanish people tell him, and he can barely trust that because they're enemies of England.
I think one thing that I did like was that the actual Jesuit priests said everything that Jack Blackthorne said.
Yeah, that was cool. He was there. Yeah, he was actually really I'd argue honourable and stuff. And just when Jack Blackthorne was trying to get him to translate stuff for him, he's like, just look on a piece of face. He's like, it's going to be hard to translate this. I'll do my best. I promise you I'll translate word for word.
Also the fact that he was like, he basically said, you're going to die, but it's going to be based off what you're saying type thing. Because I think I think he's starting to learn it. You start to see it in episode 2 from episode 1 that he needs to dial it back a bit. He can't be like full on boisterous. No, you must do this. You must do that. Take me to your leader, to your daimyo, to
yeah.
And it's like sometimes later on in the episode he starts to then see that maybe I need to like cool it down a bit. And
he's learning quickly, yeah, and also learning a bit the Spanish.
And also, I think the
Spanish, Portuguese. I mean, Japanese. Damn it.
And also, one thing I do like about his character is that, you know, at times when they drop someone, oh, this person's shipwrecked or on a planet or on an island or is introduced to this new culture. It's like this person who is like a green character or in gaming world they call a noob who doesn't know anything, doesn't have any intentions, is trying to understand the way of the people. But for him, it's like, no, he came here with an intention. He is a smart, skilled manipulator, and that's what he's plans to do.
And I like that twist when you find that out about him, and the Spanish guy reveals that in episode 1, because you know he seems like he could be like an anti-hero. He's got like a bit of a dark past, going around pillaging and attacking stuff. But also the Portuguese and Spanish have their own naughty stuff they're up to, which is cool. I like that 3-dimensionness. He's not just
some new guy who's green, doesn't understand anything.
Like Tom Cruise from Last Samurai and stuff, you know, like the typical Hollywood main protagonist. And there's something else I wanted to pick up on from episode 1, but I totally forgot. It just rang a bell and I've forgotten. But anyway, moving on. Do you think Mariko and John Blackthorne are going to have some sort of romantic fling? Because
they will.
Definitely. You saw the sort of tension between them. And then she puts him in his place and says, "You're outstepping your turn." And he's like, "Oh, sorry." He's like, "Oh, okay." But that was interesting. And the zigzagging of him, like he's like taking him by Toranaga, and then the other lord, what's his name, the evil one that wants to take down Yoshido. Yeah, it's like takes him to the woods to be executed or something, and then he changes his mind and gets Kashigi to like rescue him and stuff, and it's just like, okay, now you're going back to Osaka, and it's like he must be like, what the hell is going on? Like, where am I? Just in a world of chaos.
But I think he's partly used to it, because I think just because of I think the main issue for him is the culture and language barrier.
Yeah,
I think based on, like you said, he's been pillaging. He probably pillaged as they went through the Americas, which we find out in episode 2, that they don't go around Africa or go through the Suez Canal to get to Asia. They circumvent. I think it could be...
No, there's a special route, wasn't it?
I think it's the one in Panama.
There's the pass or something.
I think it might be because today in the real world, so Panama is the only place where you can actually go from the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why Panama has so much wealth, and that's why America pays so much interest in Panama.
Yeah, like invading it and was it under Reagan and stuff?
And then also instilling like a dictator. What's his name?
Noriega.
Manuel Noriega.
Yeah.
So they instilled him there because that's the only passageway, unless you go up through Canada and then round Alaska, or you go south past Argentina, past Chile,
it's
and
such
Peru.
A long journey.
You actually have to go through that strait. So maybe that's the strait that they came through. So he is skilled in fighting, manipulating.
He's a privateer as well. He is basically a privateer is just a way for like a
well-paid pirate.
Yeah, exactly. A pirate with some state funding behind him. Yeah, like Sir Walter Raleigh, who was helpful in stopping the Spanish Armada. And he was basically a well-paid pirate. He was a privateer. Like, these people might have been like, you might have wonderful, glorious-looking paintings of them, but they did some nasty stuff. And sorry, that's why I remember now. In the first episode, how Blackthorne he doesn't know how to refer to Japanese people. He says Japanese.
Yeah.
And I was like, Lord, this is excellent. Off to a good start. And I'm going to be watching episode 3 as soon as I get home tonight. I can't wait. It's so good, this show. What else happens in episode 2? Some politicking with the Christian lords that are allied behind that. Was the evil lord again?
Ishido.
Yeah. Sort of like basically, because for some reason those Christian lords are somehow suddenly aware of the Protestant and they want him killed. Is it that they want him killed or they don't want him killed?
I think what they want is, I think one of the key things you do see with the lords who are aligned to Christianity, one is because the one that has leprosy, I think because one thing that is in Christianity is that they accept those who are sick and also treat them.
Salvation.
While in many different cultures, if someone has leprosy, they're ostracized.
Yeah.
So partly, I think key is like, well, if I'm still considered a member of society, I'm going to stick with them. Then you also said from the priest who's with with John Blackthorne in the prison, he just who also helps us.
Was
to
he
understand.
Catholic priest or Protestant priest?
I think he's Catholic, but I think what people also forget is that the Catholic that the Pope, the Catholicism that the Pope practices is called Roman Catholicism.
Right,
because the word itself, Catholic, means all-encompassing.
Yeah.
So it basically means universal. So the Orthodox Church would technically be Catholic. So the way that they say it is that they call them the Roman Church, and then they call themselves either if it's like Egyptian Orthodox through the Coptic Church, or Russian Orthodox, or Ukrainian Orthodox, or Greek Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox. So he, I believe, is Catholic, but just isn't Roman Catholic.
Right, okay. That makes sense. I missed that detail. I guess sometimes I just like take my eyes off a screen for a second and I'm like, what did they say? Or like on WhatsApp on my phone.
And like for him, which was also helpful for us as well as a viewer, he explained, and I think that is also well writing as well, explained to John Blackthorne what the situation was. And for like fans who might have not seen it in episode 1 or just watching it from episode 2, they were able to then say, okay, so Toranaga is actually a prisoner in Osaka, and these actual 4 other regents have their own political means. One of them, who is Ishido, who's the richest and the most powerful, so he's using that to then curtail the other 3 to his side. I think either 3 or 2 of them are Christian. One because of greed, and also the potential power he can get from being able to basically trade with the Portuguese/Spanish, and the other due to leprosy and then not being ostracized from society. So you then kind of start to see that the different factions and what they actually kind of want, and you can see that. I think it's also like mentioned as well that Toranaga is like very extremely wise, extremely knowledgeable. Yeah. I think in episode 2, you also see the death of who we believe was maybe the previous regent. You see him hit the scene of when he dies.
Yeah.
And then you then see like the discussions afterwards.
What, in episode 2?
I believe it's in episode 2. It's because I've watched a bit of 3, so it might be in episode 3.
For spoilers, well, I'll watch that later anyway.
But then so I think like you then get to see the depiction of like these are the stakes and these are how high the stakes are, and that the actual, it could be the child that he's with, it could be the emperor, and that you also in episode 1 we also find out that Toranaga also has the emperor's or the potential ruler's mother as well.
Yeah,
as her hostage.
Yeah, but no, he's being accused of holding her hostage, but it seemed like he was doing it just for, moralistic reasons. But maybe he wasn't, who knows? Yeah. What else happens? I guess you also see interesting seeing how John Blackthorne explains, basically getting questioned by Toranaga and is like talking about Macau and revealing their plot. I wonder if that's true based on real life, that the Portuguese did fiddle with Japan at one point and using weapons and Ronin from Macau. That could be interesting. Also,
it's also linked to kind of like history. This might be a spoiler, so for those who you can skip this part out, but this was actually discovered by the Japanese, that the Portuguese actually did use this kind of method, that they would convert some in leadership to Christianity to then circumvent the ruling elite within that country. And then
and you see that actually that one of the Jesuit priests is like, I think the ruler, I guess maybe the Shogun, whatever his name is, Taiko, is dying. He's like, quick, he could still say the words. It's not too late. And I think Mariko just tells him to piss off or something.
And then you kind of then start to see, so that actually does happen, and that then brings about the isolation period in Japan.
Oh, right, the isolationism.
Because and I think it was the same for China as well, because both of them, Japan and China, had a huge isolationist period.
Yeah.
Especially straight after the Western nations had come. Potentially they were like, okay, then they actually want to circumvent our rulership and install puppets so that they can just use them to then profit. So they then put an isolation period.
Yeah, exactly. And that happens up until the Meiji Restoration in 1868, that basically Japan said no one could trade with them apart from the Dutch.
Yeah.
Specifically. So maybe we'll see that come out in Shogun, although that's a long period of time. But they basically kept the West out for a very long period of time until America came along with warships and said, time for some freedom. We heard there's some oil in these parts. And I guess one thing I want to point out is I think the character, what's his name? Toranaga, if I'm correct, is actually... oh no, maybe not. Because this is set in late 1600s, isn't it, Shogun? Is it? Let me see.
He said, the thing is, when when John Blackthorne he says queen. So I think it might be early 1600s.
If that is the case.
Because I know that Elizabeth died in 1605, I think.
Yeah.
Or 1601.
Let's see.
And then you had James, then you had Charles, then you had Cromwell.
Okay, you're right. So it is actually, it's the early 1600s.
Okay.
So that means that Toranaga, I think, is actually, the real name of him is, I did some research on this guy, Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Oh.
Who lived from 1543 to 1616.
And I think it was his dynasty, which is one of the longest that came into the Meiji period.
Exactly. And was the founder and first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, which ruled from 1603 until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So that means that shogun... So there were actually shoguns before that, but this is the last dynasty of shoguns, basically, because it just ruled for so long. Because I actually did some research, and the first shogun was Minamoto no Yoritomo in 1185. And going back to Shogun Total War, you can play Rise of the Samurai, which I never played, but I think it's set around then, pretty much. Yeah. Anything else to touch on in episode 2?
You mentioned... I think the scene that I think is done so well is the map scene.
Yeah, that was cool.
Draws the map and then distincts and says, okay, this is the Europe, and also being able to then show Africa and then saying this is Asia. But then also it highlights as well that no one had been able to explore further out in the Pacific to Australasia. So whether if it was Australia, which was then, I think, first seen in the late 1700s.
Right.
And then you also had New Zealand. Then you also have the other islands like Cook's Islands, Fiji, and all the others. But then I think it kind of dispels, the whole theory of, people traveled around the world to try and see if the world was round or not. But actually that had been discovered hundreds of years before that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I find this period of time so fascinating. Have you heard the phrase, we were born too late to explore the world, too early to explore the universe? But this is exploring of the world. And it's kind of exciting and cool. At the same time, but also you can see all the horrors associated with it and all the friction that happened. Yeah. What do you think is going to happen in episode 3? Well, you've watched a bit of it already.
Watched a bit of it. So
tell me what's happened then.
I wouldn't provide any major big spoilers, but I think you then get to see more of the scheming. So the scheming of the Jesuit priests and then try and take out the barbarian, the Englishman, which is John Blackthorne, or potentially try and utilize him. And then also you kind of then see how they try and then manipulate the situation. And then I think further on you then get to see within Toranaga his actual style of leadership, because you kind of see it in episode 1 where he's I know that this guy has to now kill himself, but it's not something I'm happy about or fond of, but it's something that must be done. And then I think that's kind of like seen a bit more. And I think with just like with John is that he's probably going to try and like instill himself more into the culture and also try and gain favor with the major players, especially Toranaga, to then utilize and say, okay, we both, as he mentioned, that he's now in Japan to fight his enemies, who are Toranaga's enemies, which are the Portuguese and Spanish. But then also he will then have to then play a role in then fighting Ishido and the other people within the council. And
that'd be like a means to his end of basically just giving England that foothold in Japan. I guess it'd be interesting because, from the games, I'm very much aware of like the USA's role in Japan and in the Meiji Restoration, and of course Portugal and Spain's originally. But Britain and Japan, apart from like in the early 1900s, there was this Anglo-Japanese agreement. So basically, in World War I, Japan was technically on Britain's side, so therefore by proxy, it was at war with Germany, and it took over a lot of its holdings. But I'm just be curious to learn a bit more about Japanese and British history before then. What was it like before World War I, etc.? Were they more friendly?
I think the main issue was the proximity. So what happened? What the Dutch were able to do was that they had like places in India as way stations. So the first people to really do this within the European powers were the Portuguese, and the Spanish. So they took like the Canary Islands and Madeira. Yeah. They were seen as like Atlantic way stations where they could then, and also Cape Verde as well. Cabo Verde. They would go there, use them as way stations to resupply, to fix their ships, and then head out west. So the Dutch would utilize that within India, and then would utilize that then to have like, I know they had some parts of the Philippines were within the Dutch Empire. Some of it was within the parts of Indonesia as well. Yeah. So the British, I think, got to Asia, that side of Asia, pretty late, until like the 1700s. So because I think what happened is the British fought a war against the Dutch, and in the war, the British then got the actual territories that the Dutch had in Southeast Asia. Right. Okay. And I think that's how they then were able to then build the relationship up in the relationship they had within World War I. Yeah, starting from that. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'll be keen to see now how much further this goes. Okay. Random last bit of trivia to end things. Have you heard of Yasuke or Yasuk? I don't know how to pronounce it. Oh, you mean the Black Samurai? Yeah. Yes, yeah, I've heard of him, and I watched this YouTube channel called Kings and Generals, and they did like a whole video about him. Oh, okay, what sort of stuff do they say about him? So they believed that he was a slave from. I think one thing that people also forget that there was a West African slave trade, which was mostly done by the Europeans. And then there was an East African slave trade, which was done by the Ottoman Empire, also the Portuguese as well. And so Yasuk was taken, they even say it's either he might have been from Cameroon, or he might have been from the Congo, or potentially from other countries on the East Coast, maybe Angola as well, on the East Coast of Africa, and then was taken by Jesuit priests to Japan as a slave. But then I think he was then bought, and then his daimyo died. So then he was then was allowed to then go into service and then become a samurai. And if I'm remembering right, they were thinking of doing a film. And they were thinking of having Chadwick Boseman to be the actor to play him. Rest in peace, yeah. But I think they've kind of like shelved that, and I think they're trying to I know they've done an animated film, and I think they even did a Japanese anime about it, but I think they're still planning to do like a full-on film about it. Yeah, I'd be keen to see that anime, because I only found out about that recently, and it's just so fascinating to have like someone from one culture just against his will, which is horrible, taken to such a far off place. Yeah. Just so random, like a man of one area of the world just on the other side of the world at such an early period in time. And,
when would people from Africa start traveling to Japan, or likewise the other way around? Like, when would they interact? What is like considered the point in history? Is it the 1600s, 1700s? Like, I mean, he died in he's regarded as dying after June 1582. So this is such an early period in time. It's just so fascinating finding out stuff like that and such a random mix. Yeah.
It's like, I know like there's a lot of documents of were there interactions between the Roman sphere of influence and the Chinese sphere of influence, especially during like the high periods of like the Roman Empire, because I think they did say that they had like certain text and certain like textiles within the Roman Empire which were made in China, and also the other way. I think they said like wine was sometimes traveled over to China.
Could be through third parties, yeah.
And I think the fact that we always think like, oh no, back then no one spoke to each other, everyone stayed where they were supposed to. It's only until recently that people have explored. But then like when we mentioned like in Vikings that we had someone who was actually from China who was there as well.
Yeah, in a TV show, but also you find a lot of Viking burial mounds of Chinese silk. And it might not necessarily mean that Chinese people ended up in Scandinavia at that time, but it means that through third parties, these cultures interacted. But also, it could very easily be in the realm that, unfortunately, the slave trade was horrible, but one thing was about it did mean that certain people, one corner of the world, would, against their will, obviously, be taken to another part of the world. So that could very easily be true. That could be some Chinese slaves in Viking culture, and it's just crazy to think about how that could come about. And there was one more thing I really wanted to mention, but I've totally forgotten. It's been a long day, but we will see more. Yeah, we've done episode 1 and 2. I think for our next episode, let's watch maybe 3 more episodes or something.
Three. I think episode 5 is out, so we can do 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah. Well, I'll work out how many episodes are in Shogun miniseries. Let's see. How many episodes?
10.
10. Okay, yeah. So we can do a 3 episode one. So that would be very juicy. Okay, any final things you want to add? Anything you want to say about Japanese culture in general, Shogun, or just what you're looking forward to?
One thing I always have to just say is like how the show was made, and also the writing has been really, really well written. The scenery as well, the special effects. And like just reading like what all the critics have said, it's like, oh, this is something, a breath of fresh air that we really needed, and like a historical drama that is based on a book, but kind of feels like you're in that setting. And I think also the way that they have done the episodes and done the TV series is as if like we're learning with John Blackthorne.
With John
Blackthorne, but also they're doing it in a way that it's not like, oh, John Blackthorne is learning this new culture which is behind or isn't as good as his own, but it's like, no, that at this time Japanese culture, and also apart from the bringing of gunpowder and also potentially of ships, but was still more advanced than John Blackthorne's culture. And you then start to see it, especially when he sees Osaka and he's like, God damn, like, wow. Because all he'd been was at a fishing village for the whole time.
Exactly. And then he sees like a city.
Yeah.
And you get that a lot, that particularly like a lot of European imperialists never thought of Africa as having cities predating European colonialism, but there's plenty of examples. I think was it Benin or something? Yeah. They actually had their own city and empires of their own that predated European colonialism. So it just comes to show that, one culture always thinks of itself as above others, but in truth, that they could have advancements beyond their own knowledge, including like hygiene, etc. Yeah. Also, that's what I was going to pick up on. When we talk about who was the first to discover America, who was the first to discover Japan, it's always very Eurocentric.
It is,
isn't it? And there's plenty of theories and some evidence that says that other cultures, discovered these countries first. So, for example, some people think the ancient Egyptians discovered America first, based on some theories. Pottery samples, and I'm not sure how valid that is, but an interesting thing to consider, because obviously the Chinese must have discovered Japan before the Europeans. Same with the Koreans, the Mongolians. It's like, at what point was Japan discovered by someone outside of Japan? You know, and even then, it's like the Japan we see today. If you look at like the most northern islands,
it's right next to Russia.
Yeah, exactly. So there's an interaction there with, well, did Russia really exist back then? Was it at the same extent? It's
Funnily enough, like at that time, that was just considered like a wasteland. Like no one really cared about that part. Because if you think about it, like the major parts of like Siberia for Russia, they just didn't care about. Like they're like, okay, then this is Russia, but the rest is
empty.
It's empty. So, but it wasn't until like maybe the 1700s of like under, I think it was Peter the Great, that they then started being like, oh yeah, this big slab of ice and mountains, that's also ours.
Yeah,
that no one really wanted. But yeah, I think we always forget that. Like how close Japan is to Russia, to China, to Korea, but also to the States with like Alaska.
Yeah.
And like there was even talks which China shut down that they were going to do like a train, like how we have the Euro tunnel, and that's, I think one of the tunnels is used for goods to travel up and down. That Japan, Russia, and the United States were thinking of doing their own. That so potentially you could get goods from Russia to China, and Russia to America, from Alaska to the eastern side of Russia, and then also to Japan. But then China was like, wait a second, if we're not involved, this isn't happening.
Well, yeah, of course, because I guess, the market would be flooded with goods from those countries, and it'd stimulate their economies more. And, there's a reason why so much stuff is made in China, because it's cheap manufacturing, and maybe they've monopolized a lot of trade routes, like this Belts and Roads initiative that they've been building a lot of roads in Africa and Central Asia and stuff. It's very beneficial to them mastering that.
And also, I think one thing that Shogun can help is to then have less Eurocentric, like, historical dramas. Because that's the one thing I loved about Marco Polo, is that I was able to learn so much about Chinese, Mongolian culture as well, to also learn about the people that they had conquered as well. And it'd be nice to like have more
stuff that we wouldn't know about normally. Yeah,
like I think I really loved about Vikings was like how much, even though some of it was like not history, but how much I learned from like, oh, this happened, let me check what actually happened in history, and then reading up on that and learning from that. So maybe they'll do maybe if Shogun, which it is actually successful, maybe do something about one of the Chinese dynasties, or potentially I think it was the Three Kingdoms China, which is
another Total War game,
and also like a really popular time that's depicted a lot in like Chinese media, but not outside.
Yeah, I like that too. I really like these historical dramas because you learn, and if they're done well, they can be very entertaining.
Yeah,
I know there's a Turkish TV show which is regarded as a Turkish Game of Thrones, which is about the founding of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, I've heard about that.
I don't know what it's called, but I've heard it's really good, and I do want to watch that. But perhaps we can talk about it later on the Two Maesters. Well, I think we're going to leave it there, because otherwise we will be going through a lot of history of all this time we'll be talking. We could be talking for hours about all this stuff, but we will save that for next time. To all our wonderful viewers out there, we know you like our history hits. The Viking one generated a lot of views, and we're hoping to do more of these. We'll be back with another part episode where we talk about episodes 3, 4, and 5, possibly, of Shogun. So we'll be seeing you then. And again, the usual spiel, like click the notification button when you want to hear our next episode come out. Give us a subscribe so you can be our groupies following us around. And please donate to our Patreon, because we can't do this without a little bit of funding. It always helps. That's all, folks. Have a nice evening.
I was going to say hi, gozaimasu, but yeah.
Yeah, go on.
No, sayonara. It's supposed to be sayonara, folks.
Sayonara, folks. There you go. You heard it right here. Bye-bye.